seeing the flames externally, it broached and breached inside the front of the cockpit. Now I looked down and feet and ankles were lapping with flame.
What's harder, the mental battle or the physical battle?
I was hospitalised for initially 6 months drug-induced coma in the USA. Didn't get out of hospital for 2 years. The operation tally was 64 operations, but over the course of 7 years. A lot of people don't understand that. They don't get what a third-degree burns victim goes through.
The Sail Away Uncensored Cruise podcast.
Jamie, start by telling us a bit about you and how you came to be flying on that day.
Simply put, I mean, during that time, during that era of my life, and we're going back over 17 years, I was very, very busy in my sort of daily life. I was a higher committed reservist with UK Special Forces, and I was with a unit called 21 SAS. And often I was away. I was in and out of the country doing operational training, and sometimes for weeks at a time. And I had an ambition to fly, and also had a bit of downtime that summer. So we were just about to ramp up to do a tasking in the Middle East. And I knew that was all going to sort of come on top, and I was going to be really busy, and I was going to be away for some considerable time. So when I learned of the downtime, I thought, great, this is my window that I can potentially get out there and fulfill the ambition, learn to fly. And I chose Florida. And I got armed with a visa, and off I went. And that was the plan. That was kind of how it all occurred, and it sort of transpired that I went out. So summer of 2007.
Right. So let's take it back to that day of the crash then. So what was going through your mind as you kind of climbed into the cockpit that day? Was it a normal day? Was there anything that was running through your mind?
It was a relatively normal day because, I mean, up until that point, I'd been training for, 3 nigh on 4 weeks full time.
Yeah.
On a concerted, comprehensive flying training program in Florida, in the USA. So I'd been busy, and I'd been racking up the hours. Just kind of at that stage, I'd finished doing what I was doing with the instructors solo, and I'd had several instructors as a solo pilot.
Yeah.
Sort of one-on-one initially before I went solo. And then I was solo for a number of days before that particular day and the incident that happened to me. So it was the 19th of August 2007, and it felt like a normal day. I was just going to go out there, and I was just going to do the hours and sort of hour build. That was the plan. I simply got in the aircraft, did all my checks, or did my first of all my walk round, then got in the aircraft, did the various checks, having turned the engine on and the ignition, etc. Everything was pretty normal, right the way through to active flight. And I was up there within the pattern, doing a few sort of circuits within the pattern, when a fire occurred. So first of all, my engine flared externally, and I noticed flame outside the fuselage coming from the front of the fuselage of the aircraft itself. And then I made a decision based on the fact that, where I was moving around in the pattern, I was doing a left banking turn and then finally left banking again into wind for my final approach. That's when the fire breached the cockpit internally. So it increased pressure on the front of the aircraft with that final turn into wind, and it breached. And how I knew, because I looked down immediately, having, as I described, seen the flames externally, first of all, now I looked down and feet and ankles were lapping with flame. So it broached and breached inside the front of the cockpit behind the sort of firewall, if you will, which would have been between like the engine and the cockpit itself, and it breached that. It perhaps shouldn't have done. But
so what actually caused the fire?
I don't know for certain, but my strong suspicion would have been that it would have been oil leaking within the engine sort of manifold system. And over the course of time, duration of flight, there would have been the engine would have got warmer, hotter, the temperature would have increased, and there would have been some kind of ignition causing fire. That would be my best, understanding of what went on, technically. But I mean, I don't know for sure exactly what caused it. But it definitely wouldn't have been fuel, because it would have been more of a flash kind of explosive burn and fire within the cockpit. And it was slow and progressive.
Yeah. Describe what was going through your mind when you first saw that flame, though. Was it fear, problem solving?
The first thought process that I had was literally fight or flight. So for me, it was fear, because I looked down, I saw flame inside the cockpit. Initially, as I mentioned, flame outside the cockpit before I made that left-hand banking final turn into wind. And I didn't fear it so much when I saw it externally. I thought, well, I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to keep piloting the aircraft according to the pattern, and I'm going to run in, and then my plan was to land it in the conventional sense. But now that it had breached, and I'd recognized that and acknowledged that, and the fire was actually inside, within my close proximity environment, panic and fear. That was the thought process initially. And I really did kind of feel flustered. And just to describe that to you, I mean, I could feel the tension, and I could feel my heart sort of boom, boom in my chest. I could feel myself getting, more kind of excitable through fear, and I was hyperventilating. So I'm aware of an increased heart rate and breathing rate. I was aware of how that was affecting me. And it was based on that I then sort of changed tacks in my mind. And I can only describe it as kind of trying to rationalize the situation, recognizing the fear and the panic in myself, and then getting a grip of the situation and coming up with a sort of a game plan.
Yeah. So looking back, did it go quick, or did it feel like it was a long period that you was in that cockpit and that was happening?
Initially, it felt quite long with the panic and with the sort of fluster, because that's what happened. When I was panicking, my mind felt like it was racing, and I was struggling to kind of grasp what to do and to come up with a solution about how I was going to deal with it. Because the fire was building up slowly at first, but then more rapidly as I was descending. And by the time I got so it breached approximately 1,000 feet above the ground, according to altimeter. And I would estimate that once I descended to about 500 feet, the fire was about halfway up within the small little two-seater chamber of cockpit that I was in, occupying the left-hand seat. And the fire was about belly height within that small confined cockpit. And I'm only half the drop, so I'm about 500 feet above the ground. So I'm thinking, my God, I've got nowhere to go. Where am I going to go? And I figured, I don't think I'm going to make it. I genuinely don't think I'm going to make it. If I stay within the cockpit and it still builds at the rate that it was building, doing the rough sort of estimate in my mind, I figured that it's going to overwhelm me, and I'm not going to be able to make the ground level to land in the normal sense unless I do something completely kind of outside the box. I carried on sort of gliding in, and I followed emergency protocol. I simply switched the key to the ignition off. The red switches, magnetos alpha and bravo off, master switch off, lights off, strobes off, fuel pump off, fuel selector valve, rotate off. Just following the dashboard from left to right for this particular type of aircraft. And it was a full emergency drill or emergency protocol shutdown procedure for the engine and the management system of that aircraft. And I just followed it to the letter of the law, as in what I'd been taught, and I just followed it systematically. So I did the shutdown, and I was still gliding, and I'm controlling the stick with my left hand in between my knees, sat in the left-hand seat, the control stick and my hand on the throttle in the center column, and I'd sort of knocked that to the off position. And I'm gliding in, and I'm watching forward through the canopy, watching left, also watching to the right through the left and right-hand canopy window. I'm looking for traffic, hazards, obstacle. I've also gently veered away from the concrete runway to my right-hand sort of vantage, because initially that was where I was going to land, on the concrete strip for the runway. But I've gently veered purposely to my left towards a big stretch of grass, open ground, and I'm running in towards that, and I'm gliding in. I'm trying to scrub off as much airspeed as I can, controlling the stick. I got to approximately 50 feet, and it was a very sort of last moment sort of analysis of position above the ground, and I'm looking forward, looking left, looking right, and judging it purely by sort of hand-eye coordination. So it was a 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet, thereabouts, 20 feet. That was me. I knew I had that one moment. So I was like Jack Rabbit. I scrambled onto the seat. I'd already unbuckled the 3-point harness around my waist over my left and right hand shoulder. I'd already ripped off the headset from my head and thrown that in the opposite footwell. And I'd already opened the left-hand canopy door up until that point, descending, gliding in. And at approximately 20 feet, I was like Jack Rabbit, like I described, onto the seat. I clamber over the small door lip between the seat and the left wing, get onto the left wing, momentarily balancing myself, and then I just went for it. I snapped my feet and knees together in the air as I took a giant stride leap off the trailing edge of the back of the left wing, and I made that like concerted jump to exit from the back of the left wing. And I estimate, even though I clambered out about 20 feet, she was still gently dropping out within that airspace. So I estimate that the aircraft was approximately 15 feet above the ground, and I was still gliding in at about 30 knots, which is probably 33 miles per hour, say.
Yeah.
And I landed in long grass, relatively soft ground because of a recent flash torrential downpour over the lunchtime period before that said flight that I'd made. And I landed in the relatively soft ground, and so that absorbed some of the impact. I landed feet first. I knew to jump. I snapped my feet and knees together in the air, hands above my head in the prayer position. And I knew to jump like that because I'd been a very well-trained and practiced paratrooper all over the world doing what I was doing as a soldier. And so I did jump clean, as it were, feet and knees together, but the impact was severe. So when I landed feet first, even though the ground was soft, relatively, it absorbed the shock, but I thrust forwards in a secondary impact. I face-planted the ground, and I had a bilateral nasal fracture, supraorbital eye socket fractures left and right, multiple soft tissue laceration from the sharp Florida razor grass. So I got torn over many sections of the face, lips and everything. And my index finger on contact with the ground hyperextended and fractured. You can probably see that on camera, perhaps. And I crumpled a couple of ribs in the impact, so they were fractured, I think on the left side. And also my collarbone was also fractured as well. So we're talking multiple fractures from the secondary impact. Yeah. Also, in the action of the jump, with the kinetic force travelling through the body on contact with the ground, I inadvertently ruptured my colon, my large intestine, and I lacerated the liver, which was hemorrhaging and bleeding inside. But for the record, that's not the worst of it. In the sense of the trauma, I was 63% third and fourth degree burn. And the fourth degree burn over the shin area, because remember, that's where the fire breached initially, and so it built up there from the longest period. In other words, my lower limbs were burning for the longer period. My head and neck and everything was getting it for the sort of lesser period before I managed to get out and clamber on the wing and make the jump. But I was 63% over total body surface area, third and fourth degree burn, and fourth degree is down to the bone. So surgeons had a very, very difficult task of trying to save my legs.
So when you hit the ground, was there pain, or was it just adrenaline?
Initially, immediately not, because I was still very much on working on heightened adrenaline. When I hit the ground, the immediate response that I made, if you will, was my mind, if you will, was momentarily sort of stunned from the impact and probably the face plant. Yeah. But it was like taking a big punch from a heavyweight in the ring. And then I sort of shook that off momentarily. And then I remember realizing that I was on fire. And that was obviously hence why I jumped. So I immediately, the natural reaction was to roll in the long grass. So like a sort of a sausage shape on the ground. In the prone position, I rolled back and forward in the long grass to smother the flames. I I thought I'd gone back and forward enough times using the friction of the grass to naturally smother the flame. And the grass was a little bit damp as well, so it helped. However, I stopped the movement, thrashing back and forwards, realising my right shoulder is still on fire. So I tapped that out with the opposite hand on the right side, with the palm of my hand. And I realised my scalp was still on fire on the right side. So I tapped that out with my right hand. And the fire fortunately was out. It was extinguished. Remembered the aircraft, looked, and I looked in my hands in front of my face with through the open slits in my palms, and to my horror, I could still see the aircraft airborne in the distance, approximately 70, 80 feet away. Now, to put that into perspective, that's no more than, say, the length of 2 London double-decker buses. Distance from me lying on the ground to where the aircraft was still airborne, and I estimate she was about the height of a man. So she was about 6 feet in the air, but the prop was nose heavy, left wing down. So if you will, the propeller was the height of a 6-foot man in the distance, 70, 80 feet away from me. And at that point, I caught eyeball of the aircraft, and I physically watched my own aircraft gently sort of crashing into the ground, because it seemed like slow motion at that stage. And then there was this horrible, I remember, ugly, loud crashing and crumpling noise as she embedded herself into the dirt and the earth. And then there was a pause, like a severe pregnant pause, and then an almighty explosion, probably 8 to 10 seconds later. And that was like a veritable bomb going off in the near distance. And I got the massive shockwave of the explosion coming back through me and back again, where it obviously consumed all of the immediate oxygen within the atmosphere. But I was fortunately just outside the fire radius of that explosion. So the fire didn't get me, but the shockwave I definitely felt. Yeah. Then the immediate reaction further was that I'm going to make distance and tried to get away from that danger. So I naturally turned away and I tried to leopard crawl as much as I could through the long grass. And I estimate I probably only crawled about maybe 10, 15 foot maximum. And I stopped because partly exhaustion, and I couldn't go any further because I was probably working on adrenaline and anaerobic sort of flight sort of response, just trying to get away. And in doing so, through the long, sharp Florida razor grass, because if you know the grass in the tropics, it's not like the soft grass here. It is like razor. And my elbows and my knees, and I think my chin, I could feel it lacerating with the grass with every movement through the long grass. And I stopped because of more trauma and just a total exhaustion. At that stage, I got onto my knees to look back with my hands above my face to sort of protect myself from the ensuing heat and the inferno that was still being pushed back from the aftermath of the explosion. Even though the immediate explosion had died down, she was still burning ferociously in the distance, like probably no more than 90 feet away now, because I'd crawled a bit of distance on top. What I do remember is at that stage, remember I'm on my knees looking back, surveying the wreckage. The pain at that stage hit me. You asked about the pain. That was the first time I felt it. Up until that point, no pain. I'd been on nothing but adrenaline and the sort of everything that I was doing to respond to kind of evade that situation and get myself the hell out of there. And then the pain hit me and it washed over me. And the only way I could describe that, it was like a giant tsunami. And it just washed over me like absolutely indescribable. And it was the most hideous pain that I could possibly even conjure up. You can't imagine what pain I felt on that day. Bearing in mind what I said was medically fact. I was 63% third degree burn, and with all the other injuries going on. So there was a lot that the body was suddenly facing, and the reality of that was starting to kick in.
Oh, God. In life, you get know-it-alls and so-called experts everywhere. Why didn't you use an ejector seat? Why didn't you use a parachute? Looking back, do you think there is anything you would have done different?
It's a good question. In terms of ejector seat, I've had that question multiple times. I mean, there is, ejector seat in highly sophisticated sort of modern day jet aircraft. We're talking about a relatively cheap, like trainer / commuter, manufactured in the US at the time, and it was a relatively cheap aircraft. It was not fitted with an ejector seat. There simply wasn't that option. And parachute, you do not typically wear parachute for training with basic sort of flight training.
Yeah.
For that level of flight training for private pilot, you just don't wear them.
Yeah.
And you may wear them if you're a bit more of an advanced pilot doing, say, acrobatic work. But we're talking many steps down the road to sort of get there. But other than that, I've never heard of sort of trainee pilots and light aircraft pilots, certainly not in single-engine piston, wearing parachutes. So it wasn't an option, unfortunately. Otherwise, I may well have taken that from the altitude.
So you were in the UK Special Forces Reserves. So what's the hardest thing about going from military mindset, where toughness is the default, let's say, to becoming someone vulnerable in a hospital bed, needing help?
That was very, very difficult. There's no way, I can't sugarcoat that at all. I mean, going from the gentleman that I was, which was probably par for what helped to generate the mindset on the day of the incident, on the day of the action that I described. But there's no two ways about it. I was never going to be that same guy again. Mentally, I was fortunate that I didn't sustain a traumatic brain injury as such, and therefore I wasn't brain damaged, and I still had all my faculties, and I was still the same sort of smart, sort of compos mentis individual. But I knew categorically that I was never going to be the same guy in sort of physical stature, given the gravitas of the burns. And in all honesty, I did not think I was going to make it on that day. If I'd have been a betting man, I would have said that I was going to die imminently, and there was never going to make it, and that I had not a cat in hell's chance. So, I mean, also it's probably worth mentioning again, if I take you back to the ground, just because you might find this interesting, but I went through 3 stages on the ground of mental sort of focus.
Yeah.
And the first reaction in my mind, this is what I'm trying to describe to you, was anger. Angry about what had just happened, and the fact that there's nothing I could do about it, and the damage was done. And then immediately there was a switch within. You can't be angry forever in that situation. It takes a huge amount of energy as well. And there was a switch mentally. Number 2 was despair. And I was grieving like you wouldn't believe. I was grieving like for 10 men. I was in a bad way, and it was like the grief and the sadness was just flooding out of me as to the reality of what had just happened, and the notion that I knew there's no way my life was ever going to be the same again. I was never going to be that same guy like I just described, and then trying to come to terms with that, trying to accept that, given what had just happened. And I knew that I was severely badly burned. I didn't know how hurt I was otherwise, but I knew that I was pretty smashed up.
Yeah.
And the third switch was resignation. I figured there's nothing that I can do about this situation whatsoever. I resigned myself to the fact that I was about to check out. And with that, I took my shoes and socks off. I tucked everything all neatly to the right-hand side of me, placed it all down to the right-hand side, probably because I was right-hand dominant. So I placed the shoes and socks there. But also I figured this is one journey I'm definitely not going to need shoes and socks for. So I laid it gently, and then I lay back in the long grass, and it almost sounds matter of fact, but, I was a rational, logical soldier, and I needed that little bit of order, especially being sort of special forces. I wanted that little bit of order right to the end, and I wanted to have that little bit of control almost right to the end, even though I knew that I was utterly scuppered. And I just waited in it, and then maybe 10, 15 minutes later, I heard the sirens, and they grew louder. It's like, woo, woo, woo. And it grew louder and louder, and I realised, well, geez, they must be coming for me. And of course, a few minutes later, it was on scene like a full-scale kind of Hollywood response almost. You know, where there's a couple of fire engines, ambulance. I think there was a couple of squad patrol police cars. But I couldn't really see because my eyes had reacted to the burn, to the cornea.
Yeah.
And I couldn't really see. I was blinded. But I felt what was going on with the pain, and I could hear what was going on. I could hear the emergency chatter from the paramedics on the radio. I could hear the heavy guttural droning noises of the fire engine in the distance, and it was all going on, and I was very aware of the situation, and it was not a good place.
So do you think being in the military helped save you that day?
I think it definitely helped me to rationalise and possibly to think more clearly and calmly under pressure. Although, like I mentioned initially, when I was subject to the burn in the cockpit, I did panic and I did have this real fluster, and I was starting to, just sort of lose the plot a little bit, because I was getting too flustered, and it was all kind of coming on top. But recognising that helped me to sort of calm myself. And then start, they sort of say, stop, breathe, sort of think, and then act. And it helped me to sort of formulate a plan based on the recognition of the trauma that I was going through and the response of that trauma within me. And so there's also something else that the military taught me, perhaps through my time at Sandhurst back in the day. I went for a short sort of service commissioning course as a reservist, and they teach you about like hasty estimate. So when the situation on the ground is that, you're facing enemy from this angle and perhaps this angle, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to react? And what are your options? What is your best course of action? What are you going to come up with, and how are you going to justify that? So simply put, in my mind, given the fire in the cockpit, I did this kind of hasty estimate in my mind with everything that was going on. I thought about the options. I thought about my possible escape strategy. Obviously, the foremost thing was I need to get out of the burning cockpit. The initial thought was if I land in the normal sense and run into a full stop halt on the ground with the aircraft, based on the timeline and how long I've been burning, I don't think I'm going to make it. I think I'm going to be overwhelmed. So therefore, the option of jumping earlier came to me, hence during flight. It was quicker to exit the aircraft in that manner and just bail out.
What's harder, the mental battle or the physical battle?
Not an easy question, that isn't. I mean, the physical battle went on for years. I mean, testimony to that was that I was hospitalised for initially 6 months drug-induced coma in the USA, cost of some $2.8 million.
My God.
Just to give people an understanding of how severe it was and how serious. But moreover, that journey continued back in, the UK under the care of the NHS, and I was further hospitalised for about 1.5 years. So I didn't get out of hospital for 2 years. And you asked, the operation tally was 64 operations, but over the course of 7 years. So that was an extremely difficult journey. In some cases, it felt like 2 steps forward and sort of 3 steps back, like snakes and ladders. But I would also argue that psychologically, it probably took longer. So I estimate that 3 years of physical healing until the wounds closed up on my back, shoulder, scalp, and probably altogether about 5 years of kind of acceptance and coming to terms with it.
With the, when you say about the 64 surgeries that you've had and how fundamentally it's clearly changed your life, has there ever been a moment where you've resented being saved?
Yeah, I mean, you go through all sorts of emotional turmoil. And remember the snakes and ladders in terms of the physical healing. Well, you go through that mentally as well. And at times you feel like you're on a high and you're making progress. You've had a recent surgery and you're making progress. If you get breakdown, which I had many, many times over in the hospital, and the wounds start breaking down again and more recurrent sort of incessant infection, then how do you deal with that? Well, you've got to go back to the drawing board with the surgeons often. And we're talking some hideous operations where they take you back to the theatre, they put you under, they debride you, so they scrub you down. Literally, the surgeons will scrub you down with like nail brushes, for want of a better description, using specialised cleaning fluids like iodine based to scrub the wounds, like literally down. In some cases, they were scrubbing the wounds more or less back to the bone.
Oh, that sounds so painful.
Yeah. In my case, I'd lost so much soft tissue, over 63% of body surface area, that you can imagine that is why I was in hospital for up to 2 years. And a lot of people don't understand that. They don't get what a 3rd degree, in some cases 4th degree burns victim goes through. The journey was extremely arduous, extremely long, and again, psychologically, it just goes on and on and on. And it's not until you're well away from that environment that you can properly start to heal mentally. And I absolutely do believe that not everybody possesses that level of fight. I think you've probably either got it or you haven't to stay in that level of real, long-term sort of scrap and long-term fight. And it is very unpleasant, and you don't always want it.
Yeah.
And there were moments, as you sort of alluded to, what you touched on with the question, there were moments when I felt like throwing the towel in and giving up. And I almost did on a couple of occasions.
I do think, though, that it probably did save you or played a large part of it. I mean, okay, I haven't been in the forces, but I told you before we went on air that I was in the Merchant Navy, and there's certain events where I was trained for. If I've said, you've asked me before, like if we're on a ship and it sunk, do you think I'd be able to survive? And I like to think I would, because I've been trained, how to deal with certain situations. Whereas I think if you haven't had any of that training, that discipline, I think you're more likely to go into panic. Like, I know you had a panic, but you quickly got your mind to where it needed to be. And I watched another interview that you did where you said that there was an American instructor and you heard his voice. Is that correct? And yeah, I just think all that put together is why you're here today.
I think it's a combination of things. I think, if I may be frank, it's a bit of quick thinking, quick action in the heat of the moment. And obviously in those kind of situations, certainly as a pilot, you don't have long to react or to formulate a plan and then react. You don't. Sometimes, you're subject to moments in time where you have to make very quick, very sort of rash decisions almost. But what do? You try to run with the best option. So for me, that was a no-brainer. I came up with that option. I thought, I'm going to bail out. I personally don't think that I could have taken seconds more of burn, seconds more of exposure to the flame based on how long I was in the hospital, the trauma that I faced, the operation tally that I faced over the years that I described to you. I don't think I could have taken seconds more of burn exposure. I don't think I could have done it.
If you could go back to the day before the crash and warn yourself, would you, or did the experience give you something that you wouldn't trade?
Listen, if I'd have faced with a genie, in a lamp saying, you've got this choice, do you want to go forward and live your life, in the future, Jamie Hull version 2.0, and be where I am now? And I'm doing great, don't get me wrong. Life is good. Would I have wanted to face that journey and the trauma? No way, no chance. I would have just stuck with version 1.0 and run with that. But in life, there's simply put, like, shit happens. I'm not unique. People in war, victims, and we all know about that with what's going on in sort of recently with Israel, Palestine, say the war in Ukraine. There are many victims. Many people get hurt. Pilots get hurt. People on the traffic, driving cars on the road get hurt. You could ride your push bike, take a tumble as a child and get hurt. It's just the nature of life, and it's the nature of the beast. It's how you roll with it, isn't it? It's how we roll with the punches and how we face it and how we deal with the demons that we're up against,
Is there anything you miss, though, about version 1.0, like you said?
Yeah, I mean, I miss perhaps, the fully, completely able-bodied chap, because I did sustain some deep burns to my shins. Surgeons were forced to cut some muscle and a little bit of nerve there. So I ended up with a slight nerve damage to both feet. I'm still quite lucky. I still cut around and mobilise pretty well, and I walk well and hike and all the rest of it. But I don't have the strength in my lower limbs that I used to have. I mean, I was a really powerful sort of athlete and a runner, and I miss that a little bit, and if I could go back, yeah, I mean, that would be a wonderful thing to possess, and I'd still love to perhaps, be a track athlete and do a bit of work on the track, that kind of thing. But it is what it is, and I've had to accept and roll forward. I mean, there's always someone worse off. I've known colleagues, that have lost limbs, soldiers I'm talking about, and in some cases they've lost both lower legs, or in some cases even 3 limbs because they've been blown up in the war or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I count my blessings, and considering how lucky I am and the fact that I can mobilise in the way that I do today and get around.
Is there anything that people assume about you that's completely wrong?
I think people might see the scars and think, well, he's clearly been through the mill, but they may not fully appreciate the depth of the journey that I actually went on. Because in everyday life, I mean, it's just someone else to someone else. There's a guy that got traumatized, but it must have been a bit painful, but they don't really understand the absolute depth of the journey that I went through, and the fact that and what that represented.
One thing that is certain is that you inspire others, but who is the one person that shook you and made you see yourself differently?
There's been a number of people. I mean, I'm inspired by elitism, if you will. So elitism in sport, but also perhaps elitism in business as well. As I've got a bit older and more mature, I've started to look outwardly at other things that when I was younger I wasn't so much interested in. So I'm inspired by people that dig deep in all facets of life and achieve ultra high levels of perhaps wealth development through entrepreneurialism, and they've just found niche and success. But often to get there, they've tried and failed. They've climbed their own mountains and also tumbled and taken big risks. So I've taken a lot of risk, for example, in my former life, and more recently, working on expeditions in the mountains, in scuba diving around the world, and taking on big hikes, big bike rides. I did race across America. I cycled from Land's End, John O'Groats, from London to Paris, climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Yeah. Again, it's not a boast as such, but I took risks along the way to achieve some of the things that I ticked off in life's sort of bucket list. And many people do the same. You take risks, but I have to admire people like, Elon Musk. I mean, how many risks did he take to achieve success with Tesla, to achieve success with, I suppose he practically bought what was Twitter, which is now X.
Yeah,
but he took risks, right, in the purchase and in the transaction. And again, with like SpaceX, we all know about the failures, and I watched that, and I marvel at, okay, well, they failed bitterly, but they came back strong, and then they made the concerted landings with the reusable rockets, and that journey is really coming on leaps and bounds. That to me is admirable.
Yeah.
Sir Richard Branson's another one. He's taken risks. They've with Virgin Galactic, they've had failures. They've had more recent successes. That to me, I marvel at. Other people, great sporting athletes in the world. When I was a kid, I marveled, I think, when Ben Johnson got 9.86 for the 100 meters. I marveled in more recent years when Usain Bolt cracked it with, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was like 9.59 or something. I think he still does hold those records. And I mean, hats off to some natural ability there, but he clearly proved himself and worked at it as an elitist athlete, track athlete. Sir Ranulph Fiennes, who ironically was a predecessor to me with my former unit 21 SAS. But I marvelled at the pursuits of Sir Ranulph Fiennes, doing what he's done with various expeditions, and he's failed at various points. He didn't always succeed with various journeys to Antarctica, for example, doing the solo crossings, but he went back and he had another crack at the whip. And again, I marvelled that he had the resilience to keep pushing to achieve his dreams. Many people do, and it doesn't matter what sort of walk of life, as I mentioned, whether it's sport, endeavour, expedition, business. But what I most admire is those that keep pushing to achieve their goals and dreams.
Your dream cruise just a click away. From luxury liners to no-fi cruises, supercruises.com makes booking simple and stress-free. Book now at supercruises.com and set sail on the trip of a lifetime. Get up to 10% off when using the code SAILAWAY10. Terms and conditions apply.
You've been heavily involved with Help for Heroes and other charities. After everything you've been through, why is it so important to work for great causes like this?
Well, Help for Heroes was pretty obvious to me because to get involved, that was because so they supported me in a safe, supported, sort of dignified environment with, say, sporting platforms. And I mentioned, I've done a lot of fantastic sort of bicycle rides. These were big endeavours. These were big feats. So the support that I received from them to do these kind of events and challenges was extraordinary. And I can't emphasise what that did for me sort of in the physical sense, in the sort of cognitive sort of mental health development sense. And I went on to do many such challenges with Help for Heroes as a charity, with BLESMA, British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association. So I've been a beneficiary as a wounded serviceman myself, and I've been very fortunate and I've been very privileged by that kind of support. It's important for me on occasion to still do what I do, which is why, for example, I still have the role as ambassador for Help for Heroes.
Yeah.
And it's not a full-time gig for me, but I still, on occasion, will fly the flag. They support guys with sporting equipment, perhaps a gentleman that wants to get into, business or, a job in administration or the office who might need a new laptop. They can help support that sort of endeavour and that journey. So there's all sorts of things they do, and they can support with medical costs if they need it privately and so on and so forth.
To end with, we've got some quick fire questions.
What is your biggest fear now?
My biggest fear would probably getting hurt in a major way again.
What's still on your bucket list?
I'd love to get to, say, Japan, because I've heard that's really quite quirky, a bit different, and I'd love to just meet a lot of the Japanese people.
What's the one thing that still brings you pure joy?
I love the simple pleasures of getting outdoors and going for a hike.
What's the most important lesson life has taught you so far?
The most important thing is be grateful for small mercies. It wasn't the same. I could still work with the new toolbox and I could still do things in life, and that was still important to me.
If any actor could play you in a Hollywood movie, who would it be?
I don't know, someone is going to have to be pretty versatile. Maybe someone like Tom Hardy, say. Someone versatile, maybe Jake... was it Jake Gyllenhaal? Someone said about like Tom Cruise. I think he would be great. I've always admired him, but...
we can get him some stilettos to get to your height.
The Sail Away Uncensored Cruise podcast.